Adolf Hitler's early life and family. Birth and family background. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town in Austria-Hungary, now Austria. His father, Alois Hitler, was a strict and authoritarian customs official, while his mother, Clara Hitler, was nurturing and protective. The family had a turbulent relationship, with Hitler's father being known for his harshness and authoritarian demeanor. Childhood and education. Hitler had a difficult childhood, marked by the early death of his younger brother, Edmund, which deeply affected him. He was a mediocre student and struggled with formal education, often getting into trouble. He showed early interests in art, particularly drawing, and aspired to become an artist, though his ambitions were thwarted by his poor academic performance. Relationship with his father and mother. Hitler had a strained relationship with his father, who disapproved of his son's ambitions in art. His father's authoritarian nature and control over Hitler's life created lasting resentment. In contrast, Hitler had a close bond with his mother, Clara, who supported his artistic aspirations and was said to be emotionally protective of him. Moving to Vienna and struggles. After his father's death in 1903, Hitler moved to Vienna to pursue a career in art. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts twice but was rejected both times, an experience that greatly embittered him. He spent several years in Vienna, living in poverty and often relying on welfare, which was a formative period in shaping his radical political views. Influence of Vienna's political climate. In Vienna, Hitler was exposed to nationalist, anti-Semitic, and anti-Marxist ideologies, which would later become central to his own beliefs. The city's atmosphere of political instability and anti-Semitic rhetoric profoundly influenced Hitler's worldview and his later rise to power. World War I and the German defeat. Hitler's service in World War I. Hitler enlisted in the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment in 1914 at the outbreak of World War I, despite his initial desire to join the Austrian army. He served on the Western Front, where he was a messenger, a relatively dangerous position. Hitler was wounded twice, first in 1916, in the leg, and then in 1918, in a mustard gas attack that temporarily blinded him. Throughout the war, Hitler developed a deep sense of loyalty to his comrades and became disillusioned with the high command and the political leadership of Germany. The impact of the war on Hitler. The war had a profound effect on Hitler, shaping his future ideology. He became convinced that Germany had been betrayed by internal enemies, including Jews and Marxists, whom he believed had undermined the war effort. He viewed the defeat of Germany as a stab in the back, a narrative that would later be central to Nazi propaganda. Hitler's time in the military fostered his admiration for strong, authoritarian leadership and a disdain for the Weimar Republic's democratic structure. The collapse of the German Empire. In November 1918, as the war ended, Germany faced defeat and economic collapse. The signing of the armistice brought an end to the fighting, but many Germans were left bitter, especially when the Treaty of Versailles placed the blame for the war on Germany and imposed harsh reparations. The sudden collapse of the German Empire led to political chaos, with the Kaiser abdicated and a new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, established. This situation fostered resentment and contributed to the rise of extremist ideologies. The stab in the back myth. After the war, a myth spread among many Germans that their military had not been defeated on the battlefield but had instead been betrayed by civilians, particularly Jews, left-wing politicians, and pacifists who signed the armistice. Hitler adopted and promoted this stab-in-the-back myth, using it to fuel his anti-Semitic and anti-Marxist rhetoric. He blamed these groups for Germany's loss and viewed them as enemies of the German state and people. Post-war Germany and Hitler's disillusionment. After the war, Germany faced economic ruin, political instability, and social upheaval. Hitler, like many Germans, found it difficult to accept the peace settlement and the humiliation of Germany's defeat. He spent much of the post-war period in Munich, participating in nationalist and anti-Semitic movements. This period also saw the formation of the German Workers' Party, which would later become the Nazi Party, where Hitler's oratorical skills and radical ideas began to take shape. The aftermath of World War I, combined with the national trauma of defeat and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, laid the foundation for Hitler's future rise to power. His experiences in the war and the political environment that followed greatly influenced his vision for Germany and his eventual embrace of fascism. Joining the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Early involvement in politics. After the war, Hitler joined a small right-wing nationalist group called the German Workers' Party in 1919. The German Workers' Party, founded by Anton Drexler, was focused on German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and opposition to the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler quickly rose within the party due to his powerful oratory skills, compelling speeches, and strong anti-communist views. Transformation into the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In 1920, Hitler helped to rename the party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, incorporating the term National Socialist to appeal to a broader range of Germans, combining nationalist and socialist elements. The National Socialist German Workers' Party emphasized extreme German nationalism, the notion of a superior Aryan race, and opposition to both Jews and communism. Hitler also crafted the party's 25-point program, which included demands for the annulment of the Treaty of Versailles, the unification of all Germans, and the exclusion of Jews from citizenship. The role of Hitler's propaganda. Hitler played a critical role in shaping the party's message and its appeal to a wider audience, using his skills as a public speaker to rally disaffected Germans who felt betrayed by their government. His speeches were filled with emotional appeals, blaming Jews, communists, and the Weimar Republic for Germany's problems. Hitler's charisma and fiery rhetoric made him the face of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, attracting a significant following from the disillusioned working class, veterans, and nationalists. The Beer Hall Putsch. By 1923, Hitler believed that the time was right to overthrow the Weimar government. He attempted to do so through the Beer Hall Putsch, a failed coup in Munich. The putsch was an attempt to seize power by force, but it ended in failure. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to prison. During his time in prison, Hitler wrote his manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he outlined his ideology, including his views on race, nationalism, and his vision for Germany's future. Post-putsch and party reorganization. After serving a brief prison sentence, Hitler was released in 1924, and he began the process of rebuilding the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Instead of trying to take power through violence, Hitler decided to pursue a more strategic approach, aiming to gain power through legal means. He expanded the party's base of support by focusing on rural areas and appealing to various sectors of society, including the middle class, the military, and industrial elites, all of whom were disillusioned with the Weimar Republic. The growth of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the National Socialist German Workers' Party had grown significantly, taking advantage of the economic crisis caused by the Great Depression. Many Germans were looking for radical solutions to their problems, and the Nazi Party promised to restore national pride, revive the economy, and undo the effects of the Versailles Treaty. In the 1932 elections, the National Socialist German Workers' Party became the largest party in the Reichstag, German parliament, although it did not achieve an outright majority. Joining the National Socialist German Workers' Party and transforming it into a powerful political movement marked a critical turning point in Hitler's rise to power. His ability to manipulate public sentiment and rally support around the Nazi platform laid the groundwork for the eventual Nazi takeover of Germany. The Beer Hall Putsch and imprisonment. Background and motivation for the putsch. By 1923, Hitler believed that the Weimar Republic was weak and that the time had come for a revolution. The German economy was suffering from hyperinflation, and there was widespread discontent among the population, especially after the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazi Party, under Hitler's leadership, wanted to capitalize on the instability by launching an uprising to overthrow the government. The coup was also motivated by Hitler's admiration for Benito Mussolini's successful fascist March on Rome in 1922, which inspired him to take similar action in Germany. The Beer Hall Putsch. On the evening of November 8, 1923, Hitler and his followers, including high-ranking Nazi officials like Rudolf Hess and Ernst Röhm, stormed a beer hall in Munich, where local politicians and officials were gathered. The putschists believed they could rally the public and the Bavarian government to their cause, effectively taking control of Munich and, from there, the rest of Germany. Hitler aimed to seize power from the Bavarian government and use it as a base to overthrow the Weimar Republic. The coup was initially planned to be swift and decisive, but the support from the military and local leaders never materialized. The failure of the putsch. The putsch was poorly planned and lacked sufficient backing from key military and political figures. The following morning, as Hitler and his followers marched through Munich, they were confronted by armed police. A brief but violent confrontation ensued, leading to several Nazi supporters being killed. Hitler was arrested and the attempted coup was quickly crushed. The failure of the putsch revealed the lack of widespread support for the Nazi Party at the time, and it effectively ended any immediate prospects for a Nazi takeover through force. Hitler's imprisonment. After the failed coup, Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. He was tried in a court in Munich and sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, Hitler's trial provided him with a national platform, and he used it to promote his nationalist and anti-Weimar views. During the trial, he portrayed himself as a patriot trying to save Germany from the chaos of the post-war era, garnering sympathy from many Germans. Hitler's imprisonment was relatively lenient. He served only about 9 months at Landsberg prison, where he lived comfortably and was allowed to continue his writing and work. Writing Mein Kampf. While in prison, Hitler wrote his autobiography and political manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In this book, Hitler outlined his beliefs about race, nationalism, anti-Semitism, and his vision for Germany's future. Mein Kampf became a key element of Nazi ideology, explaining Hitler's ideas of Aryan racial superiority, the need for Lebensraum, living space, for Germans, and the necessity of the removal of Jews and other perceived enemies of the German people. The book also served as a blueprint for the future Nazi state, laying the foundation for many of the policies that would be implemented once Hitler gained power. The aftermath and Hitler's release. Hitler's imprisonment was a turning point for the Nazi Party. While he was in prison, the party lost some momentum, but Hitler's ability to use the trial and his writings to gain attention solidified his position as the leader of the Nazi movement. Hitler was released from prison in December 1924 after serving only a fraction of his sentence. Upon his release, he immediately began rebuilding the Nazi Party, shifting his strategy from violent uprisings to gaining power through legal and electoral means. The Beer Hall Putsch and Hitler's subsequent imprisonment were pivotal moments in his rise to power. While the coup was a failure, it helped establish his reputation as a nationalist martyr, provided him with a platform to spread his ideology, and gave him the opportunity to formulate his long-term political goals in Mein Kampf. The rise of Nazi power in Germany. Rebuilding the Nazi Party. After his release from prison in 1924, Hitler focused on reorganizing and rebuilding the Nazi Party, which had been significantly weakened after the failure of the Beer Hall Putsch. He shifted the party's strategy, focusing on gaining power through legal and democratic means rather than violence. Hitler expanded the party's base of support by appealing to various segments of society, including the middle class, rural populations, the military, and the business community. He positioned the Nazis as the solution to the economic instability, political chaos, and humiliation caused by the Treaty of Versailles. Economic and political instability in Weimar Germany. The late 1920s and early 1930s were marked by political and economic instability in Germany. The Great Depression, 1929, severely affected the German economy, causing widespread unemployment, poverty, and social unrest. The Weimar Republic was seen as ineffective and unable to address these issues, leading many Germans to lose faith in the democratic system. Many were disillusioned with the government's inability to resolve the crisis, making extremist parties like the Nazis appear more attractive as alternatives to the status quo. Nazi propaganda and appeal to the masses. Hitler's oratorical skills and the Nazis' effective use of propaganda played a critical role in their rise to power. The Nazi Party skillfully used mass rallies, radio broadcasts, films, and posters to promote their message, create a sense of national unity, and vilify Jews, communists, and the Weimar government. Hitler's speeches were powerful and emotional, offering simple solutions to complex problems and promising to restore Germany's greatness, pride, and prosperity. The Nazi Party's electoral success. In the early 1930s, the Nazi Party gained increasing support in national elections. In 1930, the party won 18.3% of the vote in the Reichstag elections, becoming the second largest party in Germany. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazi Party became the largest party in the Reichstag with 37.3% of the vote, although they still lacked an outright majority. Despite their electoral success, the Nazis faced resistance from other political parties, who refused to form a coalition with them. However, their growing support among the public and their ability to sway public opinion made it clear that they were a powerful political force. The role of the SA, stormtroopers, and SS. The SA, Sturmabteilung, also known as the Brown Shirts, played a key role in the Nazi Party's rise by intimidating opponents, disrupting meetings, and engaging in violent street battles with communists, socialists, and other political rivals. The SS, Schutzstaffel, originally a small bodyguard unit for Hitler, began to grow in power and influence. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS would eventually become the primary tool of repression, overseeing the Gestapo, secret police, and carrying out the Nazis' brutal policies during the Holocaust. Appointment of Hitler as Chancellor. In 1932, despite the Nazis being the largest party in the Reichstag, President Paul von Hindenburg and other political elites were reluctant to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, fearing his radicalism and dictatorial ambitions. However, political maneuvering, backroom deals, and pressure from conservative forces eventually led to Hitler's appointment as Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933. Hitler's appointment was seen by some conservatives as a way to control him and use his popularity to stabilize the government, but they underestimated his ability to consolidate power. The Reichstag fire and the suspension of civil liberties. Just weeks after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the Reichstag building, the German parliament, was set on fire on February 27, 1933. The Nazis quickly blamed communists for the arson. Hitler used the fire as a pretext to push through the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties, allowed for the arrest of political opponents, and enabled the Nazis to suppress dissent. The event marked the beginning of the Nazis' consolidation of power and the erosion of democracy in Germany. The Enabling Act and Hitler's dictatorship. On March 23, 1933, Hitler passed the Enabling Act, which gave him dictatorial powers by allowing him to enact laws without the approval of the Reichstag or President Hindenburg. With this legal foundation, Hitler effectively dismantled the democratic structures of the Weimar Republic and began to establish a totalitarian state. The Enabling Act marked the end of parliamentary democracy in Germany and the beginning of Nazi rule. Eliminating political opposition. Once in power, the Nazis quickly moved to eliminate all political opposition. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other perceived enemies were arrested, silenced, or forced into exile. In June 1934, Hitler ordered the Night of the Long Knives, a purge of the SA leadership and other political rivals within the Nazi Party. The murder of key rivals, including Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA, solidified Hitler's control over the party and the state. The rise of Nazi power in Germany was the result of a combination of Hitler's charismatic leadership, the Nazis' effective use of propaganda, the political and economic instability of the Weimar Republic, and a series of strategic maneuvers that allowed Hitler to consolidate power. By the mid-1930s, Hitler had established a totalitarian regime, and the Nazi Party had complete control over Germany. The ideology and propaganda of the Nazi Party. Nationalism and the concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, people's community. Central to Nazi ideology was extreme German nationalism. Hitler promoted the idea of a unified and racially pure German state, rejecting the democratic values of the Weimar Republic and emphasizing the importance of the collective over the individual. The Nazis sought to create a Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, where all ethnic Germans would work together for the benefit of the nation, prioritizing national unity and the exclusion of those deemed outsiders or undesirable. The concept of the Volksgemeinschaft was used to justify the Nazis' exclusionary policies, particularly against Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and others who were not considered part of the Aryan race. Racial theories and antisemitism. Nazi ideology was heavily influenced by pseudoscientific racial theories, which classified people into different racial categories, with the Aryan race, particularly Germans, being considered the superior race. Antisemitism was a cornerstone of Nazi ideology. Hitler blamed Jews for Germany's problems, including its defeat in World War I and the economic difficulties of the post-war period. He portrayed Jews as a threat to the purity of the German race and as the enemies of the German people. This virulent antisemitism culminated in the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, as well as millions of others, including Romani people, disabled individuals, and political dissidents. Lebensraum, living space. One of the central goals of Nazi foreign policy was the expansion of Germany's territory, known as Lebensraum, living space. Hitler believed that the German people needed more land to grow and prosper, particularly in Eastern Europe. Lebensraum was seen as essential for the survival of the Aryan race, and it was used to justify the invasion of countries like Poland and the Soviet Union. The policy was closely linked to the extermination or enslavement of non-Aryan populations living in these areas. The idea of Lebensraum not only justified territorial conquest but also provided a racial justification for the displacement, enslavement, and killing of millions of people. The Führerprinzip, leader principle. The Führerprinzip, or leader principle, was the belief that the leader, the Führer, was the ultimate authority in both political and social matters, and that all Germans must be loyal to him and obey his commands without question. Hitler presented himself as Germany's savior, the embodiment of the nation's will, and the sole figure capable of restoring Germany to its rightful place in the world. This principle led to the creation of a highly centralized, dictatorial regime, with Hitler at the top, who exercised total control over the Nazi Party and the state. Totalitarianism and the cult of personality. The Nazis established a totalitarian regime where the state controlled every aspect of life, from politics and the economy to culture and education. Hitler's personality cult played a key role in Nazi propaganda. He was depicted as a charismatic, almost messianic figure who embodied the strength, unity, and future of the German people. Through propaganda, Hitler became the central symbol of Nazi power, and his image was ubiquitous in Germany, on posters, films, statues, and other forms of public imagery. Propaganda and mass manipulation. The Nazis understood the power of propaganda and used it extensively to manipulate public opinion, solidify Hitler's control, and advance their ideological goals. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, oversaw a sophisticated media machine that controlled the press, radio, films, and all forms of communication to shape public perception. The Nazis used propaganda to create an idealized image of Germany and to spread their messages of racial purity, antisemitism, and militarism. They portrayed Hitler as a visionary leader and Germany as a great and powerful nation destined for expansion. Anti-Semitic propaganda was particularly pervasive, using posters, films, and speeches to dehumanize Jews and portray them as the ultimate threat to German society. This propaganda laid the groundwork for the persecution and eventual genocide of Jews and other marginalized groups. The role of youth and education. The Nazis placed a strong emphasis on indoctrinating young people, believing that the future of the nation depended on shaping the next generation in accordance with Nazi ideals. Organizations like the Hitler Youth for Boys and the League of German Girls were used to instill loyalty to the Führer, promote militarism, and teach Nazi ideology. Schools were also restructured to promote Nazi teachings, with textbooks and curricula focused on racial theory, physical fitness, and loyalty to the state. Teachers who resisted Nazi ideology were removed from their positions, and new educators were trained to teach the correct values. The use of symbolism and rituals. The Nazis were skilled at using symbols and rituals to create a sense of unity and devotion among the German people. The swastika, the symbol of the Nazi Party, became synonymous with Nazi power and ideology. Massive rallies, such as those held in Nuremberg, were organized to display the power and unity of the Nazi state. These rallies were carefully choreographed to create a sense of awe and loyalty to the Führer and the Nazi Party. The Nazis also utilized the spectacle of militaristic parades, state-controlled celebrations, and public displays to reinforce their control over German society. Censorship and suppression of opposition. The Nazi regime tightly controlled culture and intellectual life by censoring books, art, music, and films that did not align with Nazi ideology. The Reich Chamber of Culture was established to oversee cultural output, ensuring that only works that supported Nazi values were allowed. Books that were considered un-German were banned, and public book burnings were organized to destroy works by Jewish, communist, and other dissenting authors. Political opposition was brutally suppressed, with the regime using violence, intimidation, and propaganda to silence critics and eliminate any resistance. The ideology and propaganda of the Nazi Party were central to its rise and consolidation of power in Germany. Through a combination of extreme nationalism, racial theories, a personality cult centered around Hitler, and the strategic use of propaganda, the Nazis were able to manipulate the German population, build mass support for their regime, and justify the horrors they would commit during World War II and the Holocaust. The spread of Nazi policies in Germany. Consolidation of power and elimination of political opposition. After Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January 1933, he quickly moved to consolidate power and eliminate all political opposition. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext for Hitler to pass the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties, restricted free speech, and allowed the arrest of political opponents, particularly communists and socialists. The Enabling Act, passed in March 1933, gave Hitler the authority to enact laws without the approval of the Reichstag, effectively giving him dictatorial powers. This act enabled the Nazis to systematically dismantle democratic institutions and establish a totalitarian regime. The Gleichschaltung, coordination, process. The Gleichschaltung was the process of bringing all institutions, organizations, and sectors of German society into alignment with Nazi ideology and control. This involved the Nazi Party taking control of all levels of government, the media, the education system, and the economy. Political parties were banned, and the Nazis established a one-party state. Trade unions were abolished, and their leaders were arrested, replaced by the German Labor Front, Deutsche Arbeitsfront, which was controlled by the Nazis and focused on maintaining labor discipline and suppressing workers' rights. The Nazis also took over cultural organizations, sports clubs, and youth groups, replacing them with Nazi-aligned institutions like the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. Persecution of Jews and racial policies. The persecution of Jews and other minorities began almost immediately after the Nazis took power. The Nuremberg Laws, passed in 1935, institutionalized antisemitism by stripping Jews of their citizenship, banning intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, and defining who was considered Jewish based on racial criteria. Jews were gradually excluded from all aspects of public life, including education, business, and government. They were also subjected to violence, discrimination, and economic boycotts. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938 marked a turning point in anti-Semitic violence, with Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes being attacked, and thousands of Jews being arrested or sent to concentration camps. Racial policies were also aimed at other groups considered undesirable by the Nazis, such as Romani people, disabled individuals, and Slavic populations. These groups were subjected to persecution, forced sterilization, and, in some cases, extermination. Military expansion and rebuilding the Wehrmacht. One of the core elements of Nazi policy was the remilitarization of Germany and the expansion of the military. Hitler sought to overturn the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles and rebuild Germany's armed forces. In 1935, Hitler introduced mandatory military conscription, expanding the Wehrmacht, German military, and preparing for future territorial expansion. The Nazis pursued a policy of aggressive territorial expansion, beginning with the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the Anschluss, and the eventual invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland. These actions violated international agreements but were largely unopposed, as European powers followed policies of appeasement, allowing Hitler to expand Germany's borders without significant resistance. Economic policies and autarky. The Nazi regime implemented economic policies aimed at achieving autarky, economic self-sufficiency, and preparing Germany for war. To combat the effects of the Great Depression, the Nazis pursued a policy of state intervention in the economy, focusing on large infrastructure projects like the Autobahn, highway system, and rearmament. These projects created jobs, reduced unemployment, and boosted industrial production. The Nazis also promoted the idea of a people's community, in which all Germans would work together for the common good, with state control over key industries and the establishment of state-run organizations to coordinate economic activities. The regime encouraged private enterprises that aligned with Nazi ideals, but they also imposed strict controls over labor and business practices, reducing workers' rights and increasing the power of employers. Cultural control and propaganda. The Nazis controlled all aspects of German culture through the Reich Chamber of Culture, ensuring that all artistic and cultural output supported Nazi ideology. Art, literature, music, and film were heavily censored and often used to promote Nazi values, such as glorifying the strength of the Aryan race, militarism, and nationalism. The Nazi regime used propaganda to create a cult of personality around Hitler, portraying him as the savior of Germany and the embodiment of the nation's will. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, oversaw the creation of films, radio programs, posters, and rallies that depicted the Nazis as the solution to Germany's problems and reinforced their ideals of racial purity, anti-Semitism, and national unity. The role of the SS and Gestapo. The Schutzstaffel, initially created as Hitler's personal bodyguard, grew into the primary institution responsible for enforcing Nazi policies, particularly those related to racial purity and the suppression of dissent. Led by Heinrich Himmler, the Schutzstaffel oversaw the establishment of concentration camps and the implementation of the final solution, which led to the genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others during the Holocaust. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, was tasked with identifying and eliminating political opposition, dissidents, and anyone considered a threat to the regime. They used surveillance, torture, and violence to maintain control over the population and eliminate resistance. The cult of Hitler and the Führer principle. The personality cult surrounding Hitler was central to the spread of Nazi policies. He was portrayed as the ultimate leader, Führer, who embodied the will of the German people and was the key to Germany's future greatness. The Führer principle stated that the Führer's authority was absolute and unquestionable, and that all Germans were required to obey his orders without hesitation. Hitler's image was omnipresent in Nazi Germany, from statues and portraits in homes and public spaces to films, speeches, and rallies. His speeches were seen as powerful and inspiring, and his authority was portrayed as divine and unquestionable. Expansion of Nazi influence and the Nazi state. The Nazis continued to spread their policies beyond Germany's borders, particularly as they expanded into Austria, Czechoslovakia, and other territories in Eastern Europe. The regime aimed to establish a Greater German Reich, where Nazi policies would be implemented in occupied territories, including the forced resettlement of ethnic Germans and the persecution of non-Germans. The Nazis used their control over Europe to exploit resources, enslave populations, and establish satellite states that were aligned with Nazi interests. The spread of Nazi policies in Germany was marked by a combination of violence, repression, propaganda, and systemic changes that affected all aspects of German society. Through a combination of domestic control, cultural manipulation, and military expansion, the Nazis established a totalitarian state that sought to dominate both Germany and the wider world. The beginning of World War II. The invasion of Poland, September 1, 1939. The immediate cause of World War II was Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. Hitler had long harbored territorial ambitions in Eastern Europe, and Poland was a key target in his plans for Lebensraum, living space, and the expansion of the German Empire. The invasion was a direct violation of international law and agreements, including the Versailles Treaty, which had imposed strict limitations on German military actions. The attack was preceded by a false flag operation known as the Gleiwitz Incident, in which German forces staged an attack on a German radio station, falsely attributing it to Polish forces to justify the invasion. Germany used a military strategy known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, involving rapid, coordinated attacks using infantry, tanks, and air support to quickly overwhelm the Polish defenses. Britain and France declare war on Germany, September 3, 1939. In response to Germany's invasion of Poland, Britain and France, both of which had alliances with Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Despite these declarations of war, both Britain and France initially took little military action to assist Poland, leading to the period known as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg, where little fighting occurred on the Western Front. Poland, however, was quickly overrun by the German military, and the Soviet Union, which had signed a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, invaded Poland from the east on September 17, 1939, dividing the country between the two powers. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, August 23, 1939. A critical element in the lead-up to World War II was the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The pact, signed by German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, ensured that neither country would attack the other for the duration of the war. It also secretly included a protocol that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, with Poland being partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. This pact allowed Hitler to invade Poland without fearing Soviet intervention, and it gave Stalin a free hand in the Baltic states and Finland. The Soviet Union's role and the invasion of Finland. The Soviet Union, having secured its western border through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, turned its attention eastward. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in what became known as the Winter War. Although the Soviet Union was much larger and better equipped, Finland's determined resistance and the harsh winter conditions led to significant Soviet losses. The Winter War ended in March 1940 with a peace treaty that forced Finland to cede large portions of its territory to the Soviet Union, but Finland maintained its sovereignty. The Soviet Union's actions were not directly related to the war in Western Europe but contributed to the complex alliances and tensions of the time. The Fall of France and the Battle of Britain, 1940. After Poland's defeat, Germany shifted its focus westward. In the spring of 1940, Germany launched an invasion of Denmark and Norway in Operation Weserübung, ensuring control of vital resources and positions in Scandinavia. The most decisive campaign of 1940 was the Battle of France, in which Germany used its blitzkrieg tactics to rapidly defeat French and British forces. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched a massive invasion of France, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line by moving through Belgium and the Ardennes forest. Within 6 weeks, Germany had captured Paris, and France surrendered on June 22, 1940. The defeat of France left Britain as the last major Allied power in Europe, and this led to the Battle of Britain, an intense aerial conflict between the German Luftwaffe and the British Royal Air Force, RAF. Despite heavy bombing and attacks on British cities, the RAF successfully defended Britain, preventing a German invasion. This marked a significant turning point in the war, as Germany's expansion into Western Europe was halted. The expansion of the war into the Balkans and North Africa. In 1940 and 1941, the war spread to other parts of Europe and North Africa. Hitler sought to secure his southern flank by invading the Balkans, a strategic area for resources and control of the Mediterranean. Yugoslavia and Greece were invaded in April 1941, and after a swift German victory, both countries fell under Axis control. The North African campaign began as Italy, under Mussolini, attempted to expand its colonial holdings in North Africa. However, the Italian forces were initially unsuccessful and had to rely on German support. This led to the involvement of German forces under Erwin Rommel, resulting in a prolonged conflict in the desert. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, June 22, 1941. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the largest military operation in history and marked a critical turning point in the war. The invasion stretched across a vast front, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The initial German advance was rapid, capturing vast territories and encircling large Soviet armies. However, the Soviet Union's vast size, harsh weather, and fierce resistance began to slow the German advance. Despite early successes, the Germans were unable to capture key cities like Moscow and Leningrad, and the Soviet Union, with the help of Allied supplies and reinforcements, began to push back. The United States enters the war, December 7, 1941. The war took a dramatic turn when Japan, an Axis power, launched a surprise attack on the Pearl Harbor naval base in Hawaii on December 7, 1941. This attack led the United States to declare war on Japan the following day, bringing the U.S. into the conflict. Shortly afterward, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, marking the full entry of the U.S. into the European and Pacific theaters of World War II. The United States' entry into the war provided crucial military and economic support to the Allied powers and marked the beginning of a decisive turning point in the conflict. The global nature of World War II. As the war expanded, it became a truly global conflict, with battles fought across Europe, North Africa, the Soviet Union, the Pacific, and even in the Atlantic. The United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom formed the Allied powers to counter the aggression of the Axis powers, which included Germany, Italy, and Japan. The war's global nature meant that entire populations were mobilized for the war effort, and the scale of the conflict would lead to unprecedented destruction and loss of life. The invasion of Poland in 1939 marked the beginning of World War II, setting off a chain of events that would escalate into a global conflict. Hitler's aggressive expansion, the collapse of France, and the subsequent involvement of the Soviet Union, Japan, and the United States created a world war that would last until 1945, with devastating consequences for Europe and the rest of the world. The Eastern Front and the war with the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, June 22, 1941. The Eastern Front of World War II was marked by the largest and most brutal conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, after breaking the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Stalin. The German forces attacked along a broad front, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, with the aim of conquering Soviet territory, capturing its natural resources, and annihilating Soviet forces. The operation was initially successful, with German forces advancing rapidly and capturing vast amounts of territory, including important cities like Smolensk and Kiev. The German advance and early successes. The German military employed blitzkrieg tactics, relying on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. The Wehrmacht, German army, used infantry, tanks, and air support to push deep into Soviet territory, with the goal of reaching Moscow by autumn. Despite initial successes, the Germans faced fierce resistance from the Soviet army, which fought hard to defend key cities and strategic positions. In the south, German forces sought to capture Ukraine and its resources, including vital oil fields in Caucasus. In the north, they aimed to seize the city of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, cutting off the Soviet Union's access to the sea and its industries. The Soviet defense and the Battle of Moscow, 1941. The Soviets were initially caught off guard by the speed and intensity of the German invasion. However, the vast size of the Soviet Union, the harsh terrain, and the ability of the Soviet military to regroup and counterattack played a critical role in halting the German advance. By the fall of 1941, the German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow, but their supply lines were stretched thin, and the Soviet winter set in. The Soviets launched a counteroffensive in December 1941, using fresh troops, many of whom were Siberian soldiers accustomed to the harsh winter conditions. The Battle of Moscow, one of the largest and most decisive battles of the war, resulted in a significant German defeat, marking the first major setback for Hitler's military ambitions. German forces were forced to retreat from Moscow, and the Soviet Union had successfully defended its capital. The Siege of Leningrad, 1941–1944. In the north, German forces laid siege to Leningrad, St. Petersburg, one of the most brutal and prolonged sieges of the war. The siege lasted from September 1941 until January 1944, during which the city's population endured extreme starvation, constant bombing, and harsh winter conditions. Despite the hardships, the Soviet defenders, aided by supply routes through Lake Ladoga, were able to resist the German forces. The siege was eventually lifted after almost 900 days, but not before hundreds of thousands of civilians had died from hunger, disease, and violence. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942–1943. The Battle of Stalingrad, August 1942 to February 1943, became one of the turning points of the war on the Eastern Front. Hitler ordered the capture of Stalingrad, now Volgograd, in southern Russia, both for its strategic position on the Volga River and for symbolic reasons, as the city bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The battle turned into a brutal urban conflict, with both sides suffering immense casualties. The Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army, cutting off their supply lines and trapping them in the city. After months of intense fighting, the Germans were forced to surrender in February 1943. The defeat at Stalingrad marked the first major defeat of the German military and began a series of Soviet offensives that would eventually push the Germans back across Eastern Europe. The German retreat and Soviet counteroffensives. After the defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans began to lose the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Soviets launched a series of counteroffensives, starting with the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, which became the largest tank battle in history. The Battle of Kursk was a decisive Soviet victory, and after this, the Germans were on the defensive across the Eastern Front. The Soviets continued to push westward, recapturing territory and inflicting significant losses on the Germans. As the Soviets advanced, they liberated large areas of the Soviet Union, including much of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The Siege of Sevastopol and the Crimea Campaign. In the south, the Germans and their Romanian allies conducted a campaign to capture the Soviet naval base of Sevastopol in the Crimea. The Siege of Sevastopol, which lasted from October 1941 to July 1942, was another example of the brutal nature of the war on the Eastern Front. The Germans eventually captured the city, but they suffered heavy losses. The campaign in Crimea marked a temporary German victory, but it diverted valuable resources from other fronts and allowed the Soviets to regroup and later reclaim the territory. The Holocaust and the Nazi War on the Soviet people. As the German army advanced into the Soviet Union, they implemented the final solution, the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed the German army into occupied territories, rounding up and executing Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazis. Mass shootings, executions, and the establishment of extermination camps in the Soviet Union, such as those in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, led to the deaths of millions of innocent people. The Battle of the Dnieper, 1943. The Battle of the Dnieper, fought between August and December 1943, was one of the largest battles of the war and a crucial moment in the Soviet counteroffensive. Soviet forces launched a series of operations to cross the Dnieper River, which had been a key defensive line for the Germans. After heavy fighting, the Soviets succeeded in pushing the Germans back and liberated the city of Kiev in November 1943. The battle marked the end of German hopes for a successful defense of Ukraine and a shift in the balance of power on the Eastern Front. The final push, the Soviet advance and the fall of Berlin. As the war progressed into 1944 and 1945, the Soviets launched a series of offensives that would ultimately lead to the fall of Berlin. The Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945 pushed the Germans back into Poland, and the East Prussian offensive resulted in the Soviet capture of East Prussia. The Soviet army crossed the Oder River in February 1945 and began their advance toward Berlin. By April 1945, the Red Army had surrounded the city, and the Battle of Berlin ensued. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, and the war on the Eastern Front ended with the Soviet capture of Berlin and the collapse of Nazi Germany. The war on the Eastern Front was characterized by fierce and devastating fighting, with staggering casualties on both sides. The defeat of Germany on the Eastern Front played a critical role in the overall Allied victory in World War II. The Soviet Union's ability to defend its territory and launch successful counteroffensives marked a turning point in the war, and the ultimate defeat of the German army in the East was a decisive factor in Hitler's downfall. Hitler's final years and downfall. The decline of Nazi Germany, 1943 to 1944. By 1943, Germany had begun to suffer significant defeats on multiple fronts. The losses at Stalingrad, the Battle of Kursk, and the subsequent Soviet advances on the Eastern Front left the Germans on the defensive. The Allies' invasion of Italy in 1943, followed by the Allied bombing campaigns targeting German cities, further weakened Nazi Germany's ability to continue the war effectively. Despite these setbacks, Hitler refused to acknowledge the reality of Germany's deteriorating position. His increasingly erratic behavior and failure to heed the advice of his military commanders led to further strategic errors. The Allied bombing campaign and the home front. The Allied bombing raids, particularly those carried out by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces, targeted key industrial cities in Germany. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin suffered extensive damage, leading to heavy civilian casualties and destruction of vital infrastructure. Despite the heavy bombing, Hitler remained committed to continuing the war and refused to relocate his leadership or acknowledge the possibility of peace talks. The bombing raids also had a psychological effect, undermining the morale of both the civilian population and the military. The D-Day invasion, June 6, 1944. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched the D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord, on the beaches of Normandy, France. This marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in the West. The invasion was a large-scale amphibious assault by American, British, and Canadian forces, and it was followed by a relentless campaign to liberate Western Europe. The successful landing and subsequent push inland forced Germany to fight a two-front war, with the Allies in the West and the Soviets in the East, severely stretching Germany's military capabilities. The attempted assassination, the July 20th plot, 1944. As Germany's position grew increasingly precarious, some high-ranking military officers, including Claus von Stauffenberg, began to plot against Hitler. The July 20th plot, also known as the Stauffenberg assassination attempt, sought to kill Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. The plot involved a bomb being placed in a meeting room with Hitler, but it failed to kill him due to a series of circumstances, including the bomb being moved slightly away from Hitler. After the failed attempt, Hitler ordered brutal reprisals, and many conspirators were executed, including Stauffenberg and several others involved in the plot. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944 to January 1945. In a desperate attempt to slow the Allied advance in Western Europe, Hitler launched a counteroffensive in the Ardennes region of Belgium, known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive was initially successful, creating a bulge in the Allied lines. However, it ultimately failed to achieve its objectives and left the German forces weakened. The Battle of the Bulge was one of the last major German offensives of the war, and its failure marked the final collapse of the German military on the Western Front. Soviet advance and the battle for Berlin. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army continued its relentless advance westward. In early 1945, the Soviets crossed the Oder River and began their assault on Berlin. As the Soviet forces approached Berlin, Hitler moved into his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. From there, he continued to issue orders and speeches, despite the rapidly deteriorating situation. On April 30, 1945, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in the Führerbunker, just hours before their deaths. Hitler's final days in the bunker. In the final days of the war, Hitler became increasingly isolated and detached from reality. He believed that Germany could still win the war, despite all evidence to the contrary. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler's mental state deteriorated. He remained in his bunker, issuing orders to military commanders who were powerless to act. On April 30, 1945, with the Soviets only blocks away from his bunker, Hitler took his own life by ingesting cyanide and shooting himself. Eva Braun, his wife, also took cyanide and died alongside him. Hitler's suicide marked the effective end of the Nazi regime, though German forces continued to fight for a few more days before surrendering. Germany's surrender and the end of the Third Reich, May 7, 1945. After Hitler's death, his successor, Karl Donitz, attempted to continue the fight but ultimately recognized that Germany's defeat was inevitable. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies at Reims, France. The surrender was signed by General Alfred Jodl, marking the end of the war in Europe. The formal surrender took place on May 8, 1945, a day known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, when the Allies celebrated the defeat of Nazi Germany. The fall of Berlin and Germany's surrender brought an end to Hitler's brutal dictatorship and the Nazi regime that had caused untold suffering and devastation across Europe. The aftermath of Hitler's downfall. After Hitler's death, the world learned of the full extent of Nazi atrocities, including the Holocaust, where millions of Jews, Roma, disabled people, and other marginalized groups were systematically murdered. Hitler's downfall also marked the collapse of the Third Reich, which had been built on totalitarian rule, aggressive militarism, and extreme racist ideologies. The Nuremberg trials were held to prosecute the remaining Nazi leadership and high-ranking officials for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other offenses. The legacy of Hitler and the Nazis cast a long shadow over Europe, leading to the division of Germany into East and West during the Cold War and shaping the political and social landscape of post-war Europe. In the final years of his life, Hitler's delusional mindset and refusal to acknowledge the inevitability of Germany's defeat contributed to the destruction of the Nazi regime. His suicide in the Führerbunker symbolized the collapse of the Third Reich, which had caused immense suffering during its existence. Despite his death, the consequences of Hitler's actions would reverberate for generations, leaving a legacy of devastation and loss. Hitler's legacy and modern-day impact. The Holocaust and its lasting impact. The Holocaust, one of the most horrific atrocities in human history, remains the central aspect of Hitler's legacy. Under Hitler's rule, the Nazi regime systematically murdered approximately 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims, including Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, people, and Soviet prisoners of war. The memory of the Holocaust has had a profound impact on global consciousness, leading to widespread efforts to prevent such atrocities in the future. The establishment of the United Nations and international human rights conventions were partially a response to the horrors of the Holocaust. Holocaust education and memorialization play a critical role in modern societies, ensuring that future generations remember and learn from the past, emphasizing the importance of combating hatred, racism, and discrimination. The Nuremberg trials and post-war justice. In the aftermath of World War II, the Nuremberg trials were held to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. Although Hitler himself was never tried, many high-ranking Nazi officials were convicted of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The Nuremberg trials set an important precedent for future international criminal law, establishing that individuals, including heads of state and military leaders, could be held accountable for atrocities committed under their command. The principles from the Nuremberg trials influenced the establishment of the International Criminal Court, which continues to prosecute individuals for crimes such as genocide and war crimes. The division of Germany and the Cold War. Hitler's defeat and the collapse of Nazi Germany led to the division of Germany into East and West. The country was split into a communist East controlled by the Soviet Union and a democratic West aligned with the United States and its Western allies. This division was a major flashpoint in the Cold War, the ideological and geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that defined global politics for much of the second half of the 20th century. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961 to physically and ideologically separate East and West Berlin, became a powerful symbol of the Cold War, with its eventual fall in 1989 marking the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany in 1990. Rise of neo-Nazism and far-right extremism. Despite the defeat of the Nazi regime, Hitler's ideology of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and racial purity continues to have a dangerous presence in modern society. Neo-Nazi groups, as well as other far-right extremist organizations, continue to espouse Hitler's ideas, promoting hatred and violence toward minority groups. These groups, though often small in number, have been responsible for violent attacks, particularly targeting Jewish communities, immigrants, and people of color. The rise of populist and nationalist movements in some parts of the world has also revived elements of far-right ideology, harking back to the kind of xenophobia and authoritarianism promoted by Hitler and the Nazis. The impact on European and global politics. Hitler's aggressive expansionism, which led to the outbreak of World War II, reshaped global politics in profound ways. The war caused the deaths of millions and led to the displacement of countless others. In Europe, the consequences of Nazi aggression in the war prompted the establishment of the European Union, a political and economic union aimed at promoting stability, cooperation, and preventing future conflicts. The European Union was born out of the desire to create a lasting peace in Europe and prevent the rise of another totalitarian regime like that of Nazi Germany. Globally, the war and Hitler's actions contributed to the establishment of the United Nations, an international body tasked with promoting peace, security, and human rights around the world. The lessons of World War II and Hitler's regime also led to the global recognition of the importance of human rights, leading to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which serves as a fundamental document in the protection of individual freedoms and dignity. The ongoing struggle against anti-Semitism and racism. Hitler's ideology was grounded in deep-rooted anti-Semitism, and his actions set the stage for the widespread persecution of Jews during the Holocaust. This legacy of hatred has continued to manifest in modern-day anti-Semitism, which persists in many parts of the world. Efforts to combat anti-Semitism and racism, including the promotion of diversity and inclusion, are part of the ongoing struggle to prevent the return of ideologies rooted in hatred. Organizations like the Anti-Defamation League and other advocacy groups continue to work to fight hate speech, racism, and anti-Semitism in all its forms. Education on the Holocaust, as well as initiatives to combat hate speech and extremist ideologies, are key to reducing the influence of groups that promote racism, xenophobia, and violence. The legacy of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. Hitler's rise to power in Nazi Germany demonstrated the dangers of unchecked political power, charismatic authoritarian leaders, and the manipulation of mass media and propaganda. The lessons from Nazi Germany have shaped modern discussions about totalitarianism, fascism, and the importance of safeguarding democratic institutions and values. In recent years, some countries have seen a rise in authoritarian leadership, prompting concerns about the erosion of democratic norms. Global attention remains focused on ensuring that the atrocities committed under Hitler's regime are never repeated, through the strengthening of democratic systems and the protection of civil rights. Hitler's image in modern popular culture. Hitler's image has been both vilified and, in some cases, glorified in modern popular culture. Documentaries, films, books, and educational resources continually explore his life, the rise of Nazi Germany, and the atrocities committed during his reign. Hitler is often depicted as the epitome of evil, serving as a cautionary figure in discussions about the dangers of unchecked power and ideologies of hate. On the other hand, some far-right extremist groups have attempted to glorify Hitler, using his image as a symbol of their hate-filled ideologies. This is met with strong resistance from historians, educators, and the broader public, who continue to fight the revisionism and distortion of history. The importance of remembering Hitler's impact. Remembering the devastating impact of Hitler's actions is essential for ensuring that future generations do not repeat the mistakes of the past. Efforts to preserve the memory of the Holocaust, educate about the dangers of totalitarianism, and uphold human rights are crucial in building a more just and peaceful world. By understanding the lessons of Hitler's regime, societies can better protect democracy, human dignity, and the principles of equality, freedom, and justice for all. In sum, Hitler's legacy continues to shape the world in profound ways. The Holocaust, the division of Germany, the rise of far-right extremism, and the continued fight against anti-Semitism and racism all bear the mark of his destructive influence. Yet, the global community's commitment to remembering the past and promoting human rights, democracy, and peace offers hope that the horrors of Nazi Germany can be prevented from ever happening again.